All right, quick thumbs up if you can hear me. Awesome. There's two words we need to define here really quick. The first is excess, and excess is simply going to be defined as past its purpose. We have an excess of something if it exists beyond its purpose. And then immoral, pretty simply just ethically incorrect according to your own standard of morals. Now, the way we measure whether something is or is not immoral is through harm. If something harms you or if something harms me, if there's any kind of harm that exists, that action is immoral. So I have one simple argument, which is excess definitionally harms. If something you do consume something past its purpose, it harms you. Take this Mountain Dew, for example. If I drank an excess amount of Mountain Dew, it would harm me, therefore being immoral. If you play an excess amount of video games, it will harm your brain and your productivity, therefore being immoral. Anything in excess is by definition immoral.
Yeah, I have to obviously completely disagree. As you said, morality is essentially completely how you define it, and I choose absolutely not to define it as anything in excess. For a start, let's talk about sex, for example. Now, where immorality begins is where you infringe upon someone else's personal liberties. If I choose to harm myself because I enjoy it, it's still harm, but it's not immoral because I'm not infringing on anyone else's rights. If two adults have consenting sex, they can have so much of it that it would be seen as ridiculously in excess. It would not make it immoral so long as they were both consenting to it.
So my opponent brings up this idea of morality that only infringes on somebody else's liberty. I'd agree that's part of it, but you can also commit immoral actions to yourself. He says, if I choose to harm myself because it's fun, then it's not immoral. However, my response to this is pretty simple: not harm. If you think it's fun, then this pleasure is still pleasurable to you. You're gaining pleasure from it. Remember, excess is when something exists past its purpose. It means it's no longer pleasurable. If two consenting adults decide to have a lot of sex together and it's still pleasurable for them, then it doesn't exist outside of its excess. So therefore, that example has nothing to do with excess or anything to do with immorality.
Well, not if you define excess as just beyond the purpose of doing it, because then there is no such thing as doing it beyond that. It's not a pleasure anymore, and therefore you can't claim that it's an excess of the pleasure. Because if I take sex to the point where it's no longer pleasurable, then it's not a pleasure. Do you see what I mean? So excess has to be defined as more than would be otherwise seen as necessary to complete the task. Now, I could be satisfied with sex after one round, let's say, but go on to do it 3 more times. And as long as everyone's consenting, it might be in excess of what was necessary originally, but it certainly would not make it a...
Sure. What we have to remember is the purpose of pleasure is pleasure. And so when something moves past that purpose, it does harm people because it's no longer achieving that purpose. That's why it's excessive. Something can't just not be pleasurable and just exist. If it's not pleasurable, it's harming you. Those are the two worlds we have to choose between today. If you're having just like my opponent was talking about, if these people are just having sex all the time and it's no longer pleasurable, that means it's harming either their mental capabilities, their physical capabilities, or anything like that, because there's a trade-off involved. Because you're no longer doing it for pleasure, that means you're no longer actually doing something that would be helping you. Therefore, it's harming you. Anytime we do something past the purpose of it, it harms us because we can't be doing helpful things instead. Therefore, it's immoral.
Okay, so I want to take the idea of there being 2 people involved in this off the table just to clear up any confusion that this might cause. Let's say it's something completely to do with myself. Okay, this is where the definition you've got of immorality really comes into question, because I don't think that you can claim something's immoral just because it's causing harm. I can do anything I like to my body. If I smoke cigarettes, that's causing irrefutable harm every single time that I do that. But because I'm not infringing on anyone else's right to their self-autonomy, it doesn't make it immoral. Do you see how that works?
Contention that the only immoral action you can take is something that harms somebody else.
Yes, not necessarily harms them. It doesn't have to be something that harms them. It could just be something that infringes upon their right to their own bodily and psychological autonomy.
So if something is immoral, it has to infringe on somebody else's right and do something bad towards them, right?
Yes.
Awesome. So then my response is smoking harms others. No human exists within a bubble. You have family, you have friends, and anytime you smoke, you're hurting yourself and you'll be ending your life quicker, which will then harm others. And so first off, if we're using his standard, his examples don't meet it, and therefore that excess of that pleasure is still immoral. Secondly, my response is harm to self is immoral. Now, if you're smoking for fun and it's still pleasurable to you, then it's not harm. We already discussed this a few speeches back. However, if you're doing something that actually hurts yourself, it is still immoral, even though you're not infringing upon anybody else's rights. The reason for this being, essentially, is that no matter what, you yourself are a moral being, and you're moving past your own purpose and hurting yourself because of that. But even under his own standard, if you disagree with everything I just said, his examples don't fly.
Right, no, so you're changing the definition of harm as well here, because if I enjoy smoking, doesn't matter how much I enjoy it, it is still doing damage, harm to my personal being, to my lungs, to my throat, to everything. No, I could live in isolation, not have any family or friends. It would still be a pleasure to me. It would still be causing me harm physically, and it still would not be immoral because I would not be infringing on anyone else. And therefore, clearly not an excess of any pleasure is immoral.
My response is really simple here. It's excess of pleasure. It's if the pleasure has moved past its purpose and is no longer pleasurable. That's what we're talking about here. It's not excess of or harm of any other kind. We're just talking about when something has moved past its purpose as being pleasurable and is no longer pleasurable. So all my opponent's arguments about how it can still be pleasurable to me, and so therefore it's moral, don't fly here, because the excess relates to pleasure within the resolution.
Okay, so let's take pleasure off the table. Let's say I smoke just because I'm addicted to it. It's not pleasurable to me, but it's still not immoral, because your definition of immorality cannot do something that cannot include something that I as a consenting adult choose to do to my own body without infringing upon the rights of someone else.
I'm a little bit confused what your point was. Could you explain it again?
Sure. It doesn't matter whether you think that it has gone beyond the point of pleasure and is now harm by definition. What matters is that if I am a consenting adult and I do it to myself without infringing upon the rights of anyone else, it cannot be deemed immoral. This is how we got gay rights, because what goes on in other people's houses that does not affect you and does not infringe upon your rights cannot be deemed immoral, regardless of what you claim to define morality as.
This goes back to the other argument I made, that people have a moral worth to themselves. You and I have a moral worth. We exist as beings with moral capabilities and moral worth. So whenever we take time to harm ourselves and hurt our own selves, we're harming that moral worth. So when we do something that is supposed to be pleasurable, move it past its purpose to where it's no longer pleasurable, it begins to then harm us. That's something I think we can both agree on. And that harm to us is immoral because we are beings with moral worth.
I'm afraid that's not something that we can agree on, because being an individual, one of your most fundamental rights is that of bodily autonomy, and you have to be able to be free to harm yourself. That's something that just comes as part of the parcel with autonomy and bodily autonomy. Because if I have complete control over my body, that means that I have the freedom to do whatever I want to it, whether that means going to yoga and improving my body or drinking bleach because I don't feel like living anymore.
Sure, I would disagree with that completely. My claim still stands that you are a person with moral worth. You have bodily autonomy, sure. You also have a responsibility to yourself as a moral being. This is something that philosophers from Aristotle to Aquinas have all agreed on, regardless of whether they believed in a god or not. Everyone believes that you are a person with moral worth. And so if you harm yourself, that's immoral.
Appeal to authority all you like. What doesn't change is the fact that in modern day, we are considered as individual and as such have autonomy over our own body. This is how that we know the drug laws are immoral, because they infringe upon the rights of other people to do what they like with their body, regardless of whether or not it harms them. You see, so claiming that humans have moral worth does not mean they have intrinsic moral responsibility towards themselves, because they are themselves. The reason you have a responsibility not to infringe upon the rights of others is because they have bodily autonomy too. That's why something can only be immoral if it infringes upon the bodily autonomy of someone else.
Government believes people have moral worth, and if you have moral worth, you have to have moral responsibility to yourself.
I completely disagree. In having autonomy, you have the freedom to do harm to yourself. That is part of being free. it is only immoral to infringe upon the rights of other people.